I'm one lit teacher, and today we're going to talk about Shakespeare's Sonnet 30.
Sonnet 30 is one of my favorite Shakespeare sonnets. It is an intensely sad poem, but what I really like about it is that it showcases the universality of Shakespeare's poetry. This is a common human experience. If you have not ever experienced the cycle of grief, you will, and Shakespeare really captures how that feels in this lyric poem. So the poem is an English or Shakespearean sonnet, 14 lines, iambic pentameter, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G rhyme scheme. The theme is established in quatrain 1, further develops in quatrain 2, and then the theme really sort of gets stuck and mired in heaviness in quatrain 3, which emulates that experience we feel when we have grief come over us from a loss that we've experienced earlier in our lives. But the tone shifts in line 13, where the volta occurs at the beginning of the couplet. So here I have marked some of those elements in the poem. Again, the rhyme scheme, which consists mostly of true or ear rhymes, but also has some eye rhymes in it. So for example, thought and sought are true ear rhymes, but past and waste are sort of close. So we're going to call them eye rhymes. When you look at them on the paper, you can see that they rhyme. The poem is written in iambic pentameter, as all of Shakespeare's works are, which is 10 syllables per line, 5 units of iambs, or 5 units of that one unstressed, one stressed syllable, which is consistent throughout the poem. And Shakespeare does a few things to make sure that that happens. So for example, in quatrain 2, in the final line there, line 8, and moan the expense of many a vanished sight. There are these slurs or ties, the expense, many a, that keep the flow but also keep the meter intact. And then at line 10, we have an example of elision, where Shakespeare has used some poetic license to remove a syllable with the word o'er, which is of course the word over, but Shakespeare has reduced it to one syllable to keep the meter intact. And heavily from woe to woe tell o'er. Transitions are particularly important in this poem, and they really help us see the different stages of the sonnet and the stages of grief that Shakespeare is describing or pulling us into. So at the end of quatrain 1, there is a colon, which moves us into the new stage. Then in quatrain 2, there's this semicolon, which then leads us into another layer then. But at the end of quatrain 3, there is a period. So there's a distinct cutoff there between the 3 quatrains and the couplet, and the turnaround in the volta but shows very clearly a contrast where we have a completely new tone in the couplet. In this poem, Shakespeare's sound devices take center stage. When you read the poem aloud, which I'm sure you have done, the first thing you notice is the heavy repetition of the S sound, which could also be called sibilance as well as alliteration. When to the sessions of sweet silent thought, we've got summon and remembrance, with the S sound at the end being consonants, things past. So the S sounds all over at the beginnings of words and middle and end of words, alliteration and consonants, which at first just sort of creates this kind of wistful sound. But then as the emotion builds and the W sound starts coming in with W alliteration, it becomes heavier. And so this is really brilliant. It's sort of subtle, but really when you read it out loud, you realize it's a more obvious feature than the sound devices in a lot of his poems. With woes, new, and I see I didn't mark there the consonants at the end of new, wail, waste, drown, flow. And so we start to hear, when we read it out loud, the sounds of sighing and crying, and later on of actual downright wailing, because in quatrain 2, the poet begins to cry, drown an eye. And so this use of the sound devices builds that sadness and shows us how it builds and how it becomes a state of sort of suspended grief before there is relief by the couplet. Another important device is repetition. So woe is an often repeated word in the poem, but really where repetition is most important is in quatrain 3. What Shakespeare does here is repeat something in every line, and it's certainly not because of a lack of vocabulary. He's using it very strategically to show us that once you get caught up in this cycle of remembering the past and you feel sad and then you get downright bogged down in grief, you're sort of stuck. And these uses of repetition then slow the momentum of quatrain 3 and make it last longer. Then can I grieve at grievances foregone, and heavily from woe to woe tell o'er the sad account of fore bemoaned moan, which I new pay as if not paid before. And so it's a brilliant use of repetition here. So what Shakespeare is doing in this sonnet is recreating the cycle of grief, which is a universal human experience. And I believe that's really what makes this poem so relevant still today, over 400 years after Shakespeare wrote it. So that's why I think this is really such a powerful poem still. And then there are some motifs that start coming in. And I think motif is kind of a natural extension of repetition because it's the repeating of ideas and images that help build a mini theme and make us understand the message. So in this case for loss, I marked things past, lack, things I sought, waste. So in the first quatrain, it's sort of maybe this general sadness that's coming over the speaker. And then in quatrain 2, hid, canceled, expense, vanished. This case is more about friends who are no longer around. And then we also get, of course, death, stateless night. Here we start to understand that he is mourning the loss of particular people or a particular person. And then in quatrain 3, pay, and the couplet losses. Then we start to see the metaphors emerge. As I mentioned in quatrain 2, drown and I is a metaphor. Death's dateless night is a metaphor, and it's a very common one actually in Renaissance poetry, English Renaissance, Elizabethan poetry. Night is used very frequently as a metaphor for death. Then I also started seeing that there's another metaphor emerging that goes along with canceled and expense, and I'm going to call it a banking metaphor, and then realize that it's an extended metaphor that comes throughout this section of the poem from quatrain 2 to the end. Expense, account, pay, paid, losses, restored. There is this idea then that love is a wonderful thing, but it comes at a high cost, and the cost ultimately is loss of a person that you love. And that's a sad way to look at it, but it's better to have loved and lost than not to have loved at all, as they say. So again, the cost of love is ultimately loss, and that's what Shakespeare is reflecting on here. It's a lyric poem, an intensely personal poem that captures the emotions of the poet rather than telling a particular story or painting a picture. And I can tell that, well, first of all, because it's one of the sonnets in the cycle that follow this same idea, which if we look at them all together is highly biographical. But even looking at it as an individual unit, I see the use of personal pronouns, I and thee. And so I can tell that the speaker is Shakespeare himself speaking to a lost friend or friends. And lyric, by the way, is a tie back to ancient Greece where poems were sung and accompanied perhaps by a lyre, which is the picture that I have in the bottom right corner there. So the poem builds to a crescendo like a piece of music and then resolves into a peaceful resignation in the couplet. I've added a few new layers here with the time motif, old time, past, afresh, new pay. So there is this idea of it's a cycle, it happens over time. And by the way, by the end of the poem, we realize that it will happen again. We're not free from the idea of grief, but for now, we certainly are relieved of some of it, and we feel a little bit better. So there are contrasts then that go along with that idea. Most obviously, the contrast between new and end, new in the beginning of the poem at line 4 and end at the very end, and then also new pay and losses restored. So Shakespeare's Sonnet 30 is, as I said, an intensely sad poem, but Shakespeare gives us an opportunity to recover in the couplet And it really recreates the universal human experience of loss and depression and the cycle of grief, primarily through the use of sound devices. I hope you enjoyed this presentation on Sonnet 30. If you did, please go ahead and subscribe to my YouTube channel, One Lit Teacher, where there are some other presentations about Shakespeare's sonnet, poetry in general, and other great works of literature by other authors.